Hearing will come to order. I want to welcome the witnesses today before the Senate Budget Committee. This is really an outstanding group of economists, all of them with high credibility, and all of them people who have testified before this committee on many occasions, and we very much appreciate your willingness to come back at this important moment. Today we'll focus on the economy and additional steps that could be taken to strengthen our economy. We're fortunate to have three outstanding witnesses. Dr. Mark Zandi, Chief Economist at Moody's Analytics. Dr. Zandi has been very helpful to this committee and has testified here several times, as I mentioned before. We're grateful that he could be here again today. Dr. Chad Stone, Chief Economist at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Dr. Stone was the Chief Economist here at the Budget Committee in 2001 and 2002. We're delighted to have him back. Dr. Kevin Hassett, the Senior Fellow and Director of the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. Dr. Hassett last appeared before our committee as a witness in 2006, and we're very pleased to have him back as well. I want to begin by providing an overview of our economic situation, at least from my perspective. It's important to remember just a few years ago we were in the midst of a financial crisis and severe recession, the worst recession since the Great Depression. The federal response to that crisis, I believe, helped us pull back from the brink and helped put us on the road to recovery. But that recovery has now slowed and may be faltering, and we face a very real threat of slipping back into recession. That's the fundamental reason for this hearing. I believe it's imperative that we look at all of our options going forward. Let me just review what has happened to economic growth. In the fourth quarter of 2008, the economy contracted at a rate of 8.9%. Positive economic growth returned in the third quarter of 2009, and we now have had 8 consecutive quarters of growth. But growth has clearly slowed this year to only 0.4% in the first quarter and 1% in the second quarter. Private sector job growth has followed a similar pattern. In January of 2009, the economy was losing more than 800,000 private sector jobs a month. Private sector job growth returned in March of 2010, and we have now had 18 consecutive months of growth. However, in August, we gained only 17,000 private sector jobs, which is clearly far below what is needed. We have to do better. And the unemployment rate remains stubbornly high. As of August, the unemployment rate was 9.1%. We know that some of the drag holding back recovery is caused by the nature of the recession that preceded it. Economists have found that following recessions that were caused by or accompanied by a severe financial crisis, recoveries tend to be shallower and take much longer to recover from. Here's what two leading economists, Dr. Carmen Reinhart and Dr. Vincent Reinhart, found in their research. They wrote, and I quote, "Real per capita GDP growth rates are significantly lower during the decade following severe financial crises. In the 10-year window following severe financial crises, unemployment rates are significantly higher than in the decade that preceded the crisis. The decade of relative prosperity prior to the fall was importantly fueled by an expansion in credit and rising leverage that spans about 10 years. It is followed by a lengthy period of retrenchment that most often only begins after the crisis and lasts almost as long as the credit surge. In other words, we could see an extended period of low growth and relatively high unemployment due to the fact that we are recovering from a severe financial crisis. At the time forecasts were made that we would have an 8% unemployment rate following this financial crisis, I said at the time I did not believe that forecast. And I did not believe it because it was based on recovery from the previous 9 recessions. And this is not a recession or downturn that can be compared to the previous recoveries from the 9 earlier recessions. And why not? Because huge damage was done to the financial sector. And I am pleased to see that the research done by the two Reinhardts really confirms that view, that after a severe financial crisis, the downturn is much longer and more severe. We also know the federal response to the recession and financial crisis, and I say this is my view, helped to pull the economy back from the brink and made the recovery stronger than it would have been without it. One of our witnesses here today, Dr. Zandi, along with Dr. Alan Blinder, a former vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, completed a study last year that measured the impact of federal actions to shore up the economy, including both the Fed's monetary policy actions and the fiscal policy actions taken by Congress and the administration. Here is a quote from that report. We find that its effects, talking about the federal response to the downturn, on real GDP, jobs, and inflation are huge and probably averted what could have been called Great Depression 2.0. When all is said and done, the financial and fiscal policies will have cost taxpayers a substantial sum, but not nearly as much as most had feared, and not nearly as much as if policymakers had not acted at all. If the comprehensive policy responses saved the economy from another depression, as we estimate, they were well worth their cost. I'd welcome any further comment from Dr. Zandi in his testimony on this point. This chart shows Dr. Zandi and Dr. Blinder's estimate of the number of jobs we would have had without the federal response. It shows we would have had 8.1 million fewer jobs in the second quarter of 2010 if we had not had the federal response. And by the federal response, I'm talking about TARP, I'm talking about stimulus, the combination of those federal responses. We see a similar picture in the unemployment rate. If we had not had the federal response, the unemployment rate would have been 15%, according to their analysis, in the second quarter of 2010, and would have continued rising to 16.2% in the fourth quarter of 2010. Looking forward, it is clear, again I say this is my view, the great thing about our country is we have diverse views, and we will see them expressed here today, no doubt. This is my view. I believe we need a two-tracked approach, with policies geared to increase short-term economic growth and job creation, coupled with policies to reduce long-term debt. I think many know I have felt very strongly about the debt threat for many years. Judd Gregg and I, when he was the ranking member, proposed 5 years ago a commission to deal with the looming debt threat. I believe that with every fiber in our being, that this debt threat constitutes a serious matter for the country going forward, but I also recognize we are in a period of continuing weakness, and the really tough steps that need to be taken need to be carefully timed. Here's what CBO Director Elmendorf said about such a two-tracked approach in his testimony this week before the Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. And I quote Dr. Elmendorf, "There is no inherent contradiction between using fiscal policy to support the economy today, while the unemployment rate is high and many factories and offices are underused, and imposing fiscal restraint several years from now when output and employment will probably be close to their potential. If policymakers wanted to achieve both a short-term economic boost and longer-term fiscal sustainability, the combination of policies that would be most effective, according to our analysis, would be changes in taxes and spending that would widen the deficit today but narrow it later in the decade." I believe Dr. Elmendorf has that right. The Obama administration has now proposed legislation designed to spur near-term growth and job creation. Here are key provisions in the President's Jobs Act. 1, it would cut payroll taxes for employees and employers. 2, it would provide tax cut for businesses to encourage growth and hiring. 3, it would provide for investments in infrastructure, including roads, rail, airports, and schools. It would provide funding for states to prevent layoffs of teachers, police, firefighters, and it would help provide for the long-term unemployed. That is to all be done in the context of an overall plan to reduce deficits and debt over the next 10 years in a significant way. I hope our witnesses will comment on the merits of these proposals from their perspective and let us know if there are other policies Congress